Good morning. This presentation will be about helminths and Crohn's disease. So what are helminths? Helminths are small intestinal parasites. They're also called whipworm and intestinal nematodes. They typically develop in eggs in the soil. They live their juvenile and adult lives in the mucosal lining of the intestine of organisms, and they deposit their eggs in the feces of their host organism, which then gets pooped out, and then the eggs can develop in the soil again. Tricerus suis is a helminth that typically colonizes pigs. Tricerus muris is a helminth that typically colonizes mice. In both of these hosts, ordinary colonization produces little intestinal injury, but heavy colonization induces inflammation, blood loss, and abdominal pain, which we'll see is the opposite of what we want. So what is Crohn's? Crohn's disease is one of the two diseases that falls under inflammatory bowel disease, the other one being ulcerative colitis, which we'll look at shortly. It causes inflammation of your digestive tract, which can lead to abdominal pain, severe diarrhea, fatigue, weight loss, and malnutrition, along with other complications, both surgically and just in quality of life. Causes are genetics and or an abnormal immune response to a pathogen or a bacterium in our intestine. There's no known cure, only symptom treatment, and treatment can involve the use of antibiotics, immunosuppressants, and anti-inflammatories. In what parts of the world does Crohn's disease and helminths reside? So there is found to be a strong inverse relationship between the presence of intestinal parasites and the occurrence of Crohn's disease and other forms of inflammatory bowel disease. We have known this for a long time, but up until recently, the relationship was assumed to be coincidental. However, a symbiotic relationship has been proposed, where the host organism provides a home and food in exchange for protection. The example in this case would be the parasites live in the gut and protect the host organism from poor microbiota and prevents poor response. So the claim is that intestinal helminths can provide treatment for individuals with inflammatory bowel disease, which includes Crohn's disease. So overall, Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis are caused by dysregulated immune responses to our intestinal contents, and they may be related to our gut microbiota, which we'll see in the final paper that we look at. Th1 and Th2 responses act by cytokine secretion and are considered helper T cell pathways. Th1 acts in response to bacterial and viral infections, and they act via inflammatory agents. And Th2 response is often what's behind allergic reactions. And each response downregulates the other. And so the first paper that I looked at was Tricerus suis seems to be safe and possibly effective in the treatment of inflammatory bowel disease. So 7 patients were studied, 3 with ulcerative colitis and 2 with Crohn's. Baseline medications were continued throughout the course of the study, which we'll look at in a second. Participants were given 2,500 eggs at the beginning of the study to take orally. These eggs were harvested from pig feces, and they were then sterilized, and the pigs tested negative for hepatitis C and other pathogens, and once the eggs were sanitized, they were suspended in Gatorade for ingestion. Checkups were completed every 2 weeks for 3 months, and The criteria was measured by the inflammatory bowel disease quotient, or the Crohn's disease activity index. And we're not going to worry about the last one because it doesn't have to do with Crohn's disease. And the CDAI require them to keep a daily diary of their bowel habits. And then post-observation, they found that the 4 participants that did the worst, they were given the same dose in 3-week periods as a follow-up study, and we'll also be looking at that. So, the patients initially, the patients selected for the study had chronic symptoms that had not responded to conventional therapy, so the immunosuppressants, the anti-inflammatories. Several patients had been tried on methotrexate, and one patient had been on a controlled trial of RIL-10, which didn't work, and these are pretty heavy-duty treatments. AZA stands for azathioprine, which is an immunosuppressive. You see that over on the right here. 6-mercapturine is what 6-MP is, which is also an immunosuppressive. And HDP is high-dose prednisone, which is also an immunosuppressive. If all these drugs were taken in consistent doses before the study started, they were continued throughout the study. However, 1 star means that they had no response to the drugs, which is pretty much all of them. And 2 stars means that they had pancreatitis related to those drugs. So that includes patient 3 and patient 6. What's worth noting is that patient 3 and 4 had a prior ileal resection, which means part of their ileum was removed. And we're seeing a fairly high variation in age, from low 30s to mid 60s, variation in disease location, and a variation in duration from 5 years to 17 years, which is a really long time. So studying the IBDQ scores, 6 out of the 7 patients achieved remission after 8 weeks. And remission is defined as a rise in the IBDQ score to over 170 points at any point in this study. So the best example of this is patient 4, where they reach a remission score from week 2 to week 8, but then drop down again in week 10 and 12, but they're still listed as being in the remission category. So afterwards, patient 1 did not require another treatment for at least 7 months, so that meant that it was a long-term treatment. 2 and 5 were unreliable in the follow-up. Patient 3 and 4, which, remember, these are the ones that had the ileal resection, were the worst responding out of the Crohn's disease group. And the effect seemed to be temporary, especially for these 2. And in patient 3, they received the treatment every 3 weeks for 18 weeks, and finally achieved remission, and patient 4 achieved remission in the maintenance period as well. However, they didn't talk about how long it took. This graph here is showing the percentage of the patients that achieved remission at each week. As we can see, there was a lapse in treatment from week 2 to 4, or not a lapse, a lag in treatment from week 2 to 4, and that's when we really start to see the treatment kick in. In conclusion, all patients showed signs of improvement during the clinical trial. All Crohn's disease patients achieved remission either during the clinical trial, 86% did, or the maintenance period, 100% did. No significant clinical complications occurred in the patients. A lag of 2 to 4 weeks was seen before the majority achieved remission. At the end of the clinical period, 2 of the 3 patients that achieved remission relapsed, and the maintenance therapy suggests that ongoing treatment is a viable option. So the second paper that I looked at, which is the one that you guys read, was Triceratops suis therapy in Crohn's disease, which is a follow-up study to the study that we just looked at. 29 patients with active Crohn's disease, which meant they had a CDAI over 220, which is a moderate level of Crohn's disease, were studied. Similar to the first study, 2,500 Triceratops suis ova were given every 3 weeks for 24 weeks. The ova were harvested from pig feces. They were sterilized and suspended in Gatorade. Baseline medications were continued with a few exceptions. The medications mostly included the immunosuppressants that we saw in the last study. However, they were excluded from the study if the treatment included antibiotics, antifungal, or antiparasitic medications, or they had taken other immunomodulatory agents, including miniflexab. And so the variation in this study was supposed to mimic the disease distribution throughout the general population, so moderate and fairly long-term. Here's a breakdown of patient characteristics. As we're seeing, the disease duration went anywhere from under 3.9 to over 3.9 years. And for the CDAI, patients kept diaries of clinical symptoms. At week 12, so looking here at this graph on the left, 22 out of 29 patients responded, which means they did have a negative change in the CDAI, which is a positive change in symptoms. And then 19 out of 29 achieved remission after 12 weeks, as you can see in this first graph. And at week 24, 23 out of 29 patients responded, and 21 out of 29 remissed. So, looking here. And then 6 patients with a CDAI of 250 to 220, which is kind of the lower end of moderate. They all achieved remission. And the ones that I want you to notice here that are similar to the previous study are the patients that had a resection, did not have as high of a response, 2 out of 5, and then the immunosuppressive group responded with 13 out of 14 patients responding. So, in conclusion of this paper, the response rate of the treatment was 80% and the remission rate was 73%. No side effects or complications due to the treatment. 5 patients withdrew, but they were still included in the analysis. 1 patient withdrew due to pregnancy, and the other 4 due to ongoing disease activity. There was no significant difference between the groups based on sex, age, duration of disease, smoking status, or location of disease. However, patients using immunosuppressive drugs improved to a greater degree, and patients that had a terminal ileum resection did not respond as strongly. However, the study was open label, which means everyone knew what they were taking, so they could not discount a large placebo effect, even though these results were much higher than they would have anticipated from a placebo response. So the final paper that I looked at was called Helminth Infection Promotes Colonization Resistance via Type 2 Immunity. Just as a run-up, there's a genetic connection between NOD2 variants, which is a gene, and the variant is recessive, double recessive, and Crohn's disease susceptibility. Mice deficient in NOD2 develop intestinal abnormalities dependent on the presence of B. vulgatus, which is a gut bacteria. And the most notable abnormality that they found was a small intestine goblet cell defect that resulted in a poor mucus layer, which allowed the B. vulgatus bacteria to sustain their colonization and outcompete other bacterium. And then they treated mice which had the NOD2 mutation, the presence of B. vulgatus, with T. mirus. So, as we see in figure B, on the right side is the number of goblet cells that were restored after treatment with T. mirus as compared to the uninfected. As we see, the NOD2 number of the uninfected is much lower than the NOD2 number of the T. mirus infected. And also inflammatory markers such as Reg3 beta and the percentage of IFN cells went down. As we see, the wild type in D and E are very similar, but from NOD2 uninfected to NOD2 treated with T. mirus, there's a large decrease in both. So that basically means that it's just less inflamed. So mucus response by the Th2, mucus production by the Th2 response allowed for the growth of clostridiols, they found, which inhibited B. vulgaris colonization by outcompeting the B. vulgaris. As we see in this graph here, that the clostridiols increased by an LDA score of 4, while the bacteroides decreased by an LDA score of 4. So they also did a study in Malaysia where they treated native individuals from the Orang Asali, which is just the native tribe of Malaysia. They had a high number of intestinal parasites and a low occurrence of Crohn's disease. And they treated them with albendazole, which is an antiparasitic. And we see that pre-treatment, the number of clostridiols is high and the bacteroides is very low. And the diversity of gut microbiota is generally higher. But after treatment, we see that the percentage of clostridiols goes down, the bacteroides goes up, and the overall diversity goes down. So the conclusion to this paper, the results were confirmed with a second helminth, Hyglomysoides polygyrus, which had an even higher Th2 response. Helminths cause a type 2 immune response, which promotes mucus production and favors clostridiols over B. vulgaris, which allows the mucus layer to return back to normal. And the response would only be viable in humans with the NOD2 mutation. There are a large number of Crohn's disease sufferers that do not have the NOD2 variation. So, in our discussion, helminths treatment upregulates Th2 cytokine pathways and downregulates Th1. This causes a lowering of inflammatory agents. It also causes reparation of goblet cells in the small intestine, which can rebuild the mucosal layer. This then causes the colonization of clostridiols, which outcompete bacteroides and increase microbial diversity. The treatment would only work in those with a mutated NOD2 pathway, and Remission is seen in the majority of patients. In the first study, 100%. In the second study, 73%. And there are no side effects reported. So I think we can conclude that helminth treatment is able to reduce symptoms of Crohn's disease via upregulation of CH2 cytokines and downregulation of Th1 cytokines. And this treatment is almost symptom-free. Discussion questions.